If everyone has come in who wants to come in, we have a few seats left. There's one up front, there's two over here.
One by piano.
And there's also one by the piano. So, anyway, I'm going to introduce tonight. We're going to keep it very brief because, first of all, you all know Rabbi Panitz. You all know his background, and if you don't think you get enough information tonight, you come tell me, and next time we'll do a bigger one. However, the weather is not very nice, and both Uwe and Rabbi Panitz have to return to Norfolk. And I want them to get out of here before the weather gets bad, because we don't want anything to happen to either one of them. Right, Uwe?
Yes, I can agree.
Okay. So welcome. We're going to talk about Moses tonight. I'm sure most of you at least saw the movie. Our next movie is going to be David and Bathsheba. And according to Uwe, it will be shown in this room. I should tell you first the date. Friday, March 8th, here in the Chesapeake Room. Unfortunately, there is a conflict for another day that week, so it's one night. And then the rabbi will be back on Tuesday, March 11th. 1 month from right now. So, I hate this expression. Without further ado, here is Rabbi Panitz.
Thank you, Judy. And good evening, everyone. How nice to see you. By now I've come to recognize many of the members of our group, and it's always good to see you again. I pray and hope that you're in good health, and happy to have an evening devoted to study and cultural pursuits. Tonight I'll be discussing the film Moses the Lawgiver. Moses the Lawgiver didn't start its life as a feature film. It started as a 6-hour television miniseries. It was filmed in 1973 and 1974, and what you saw was a 141-minute abridgment of that 6-hour series. Now, I watched the abridgment not too long ago, and I think it's pretty smooth. There were not a lot of places where I thought, gee, this is a strange jump. So you may not have been immediately aware that it's an abridgment, but if you're wondering why some beloved feature of the story was not present, then it could be that it's in the longer one. Although I will tell you there are some beloved features of the DeMille story which are most decidedly not present, and I'll be talking about that. How many of you are familiar with the 10 Commandments from 1956, starring Yul Brynner as Pharaoh Ramesses, Charlton Heston as Moses, right? So I think a lot of people know that film. Certainly more people know that film than know the one that we just watched. So please bear in mind that this is the first retelling of the Moses story in the Hollywood setting after that one. And that it was done 17 or 18 years after, with no other Moses movies in the middle. So in some ways, the choices made in this film were deliberately to be different from the DeMille film. Keep that in mind, please. Excuse me. This film does have the distinction of having been approved by Pope Paul VI.
All right.
That's Pope Paul VI approved of this film. What happened was that it was filmed by a partially Italian co-production and English co-production. It was filmed in Rome and also on location in Israel and in Morocco. And the Italian government suggested that the producer of the series, whose name is Lou Grade, would meet with the Pope. And he did. Although I will say that the producer's wife insisted, and that may have had something to do with it. So Lou and Kathy Grade had a private audience with the pontiff, who told them of his pleasure at the film. And he also offered his endorsement to be used for publicity purposes. Think about that. Even DeMille couldn't get that. And the Pope then suggested that he should do another film, and he should call it In the Footsteps of Jesus. And in fact, the suggestion was taken up, and it was turned into the mini-series, Jesus of Nazareth. So that's a little bit of the unknown sidebar story to this film. Now, in the trailer, and I'm not sure if you saw the trailer or just the film itself, but in the trailer there was a most revealing sentence. And I think that sentence holds the key to our understanding why is our retelling different from the more famous Ten Commandments retelling. In the trailer, it introduces Moses as, the man who did this and the man who did that, the one who was God's agent for taking Israel out of Egypt, and the one who went up Mount Sinai, everything that you expect. And then it adds, but he was a man like us. A man like us. So I'd like us to, first of all, corroborate that, and then I'd like us to reflect a little bit on why the film chose that choice. Do you recollect Moses having a stammer when he's in a state of emotional upsetness? For example, when he comes back from the desert to confront the Pharaoh, and he wants the Pharaoh to let the people go. Do you remember that the actor Burt Lancaster was a very fine actor? His body language is halting and submissive. His posture is somewhat bent. He's slow of speech. And of course, the king is utterly scornful of all that. So, biblically speaking, why would Moses be considered slow of speech? Was Charlton Heston ever slow of speech? So if you say that Charlton Heston is the defining performance of Moses, then you find yourself on the defensive. How dare Burt Lancaster be slow of speech if Charlton Heston wasn't slow of speech? And yet, let's remember what the Bible has to say about this. In the Bible scene of Moses at the burning bush, does Moses immediately say, oh yeah, I want to do this, send me, Lord, send me? He doesn't do that, right? That's Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6 says, send me, send me. But not Moses.
No.
Moses has lots of reasons why he's not the right one to be chosen. And at one point he says, the Hebrew word is kivad peh uchivad lashon. Literally, that means heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. That's literally what the Bible means. Now, what could that mean? Well, if we read the Bible in context, it probably means that Moses is not eloquent. He has a hard time just stringing words together. And why would that seem to be the basic meaning of what the Bible is saying? Because of God's answer in that paragraph. God says, well, that's nothing to worry about. Aaron, your brother, will be your spokesperson. You will instruct him what to say, and he'll be the one to say it. So, clearly, whatever heavy of tongue, heavy of mouth means, it has to do with Moses fearing that his vocal performance will be inadequate, and God reassuring him. Now, interestingly enough, the rabbis told a sidebar story about this, and I want to share it with you because it's a fascinating story. In the story, Pharaoh's astrologers noticed some brilliant shooting star on the night that Moses was born. And they told Pharaoh that a challenge to your reign has just been born. And so Pharaoh, in response, ordered the genocidal infanticide of all the Hebrew males. That's the sidebar story to explain why he did that. Our movie has another explanation, which I'll come back to. And then when Pharaoh's daughter shows up with a son, her son from the Nile, which is where Pharaoh commanded that that be the instrument of death for the males, right? Every male child let him be thrown into the Nile. So Pharaoh is suspicious in the rabbinic story. And he decides to test this baby. And if the baby shows signs of being too precocious, he'll have him be killed. So he sets before baby Moses two piles, a pile of gleaming gold ingots, and a pile of heated metal so that it glows. And the test is, if Moses, still a baby, reaches for the gold, that'll be a sign that he's a danger to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh will have him be killed. And Moses, being the baby, does begin to reach for the gold. And the angel, Gabriel, who is his guardian angel, takes his hand and pushes it to the glowing hot metal, burning hot. And baby Moses burns his hand, and then instinctively puts his hand to his mouth, to try to quench and he burns his palate as well. And ever since that point, according to the rabbis, Moses suffered from a speech impediment. Isn't that a fascinating story?
Yes.
By the way, that story also echoes in another Moses film that we will not see in this series, but I warmly recommend it. It's a very good film. It's a very good Moses retelling. It's called Moses. It's from 1995, and it has a wonderful actor portraying Moses. Do you know the name Ben Kingsley?
Oh, yeah.
One of the great actors of the generation. Portrays Moses in that movie. And Ben Kingsley, likewise, becomes stammering and halting of speech when he gets too excited. So that didn't come from Charlton Heston. It may have come from Burt Lancaster's performance, or it may have come from the script writers knowing the rabbinic story, but it certainly didn't come from the Ten Commandments. See that? So we have Moses, who has a very human failing in this film. He's not eloquent like Charlton Heston. There's another moment as well. Do you see where Moses is irritated with the Israelites? Do you remember the scene where he says, "I'm sick of you"? Remember that? Now, Charlton Heston might thunder denunciation to the wicked sinners. That would be righteous indignation. But he wouldn't say in a kind of a personal revelatory moment, "I'm sick of you." So there too, Moses being depicted as, quote unquote, a man like us. And the third and final example I'll give for this theme is found near the end of his life. Moses is already lying down on a pallet. Clearly he's about to die. He's going to die soon. And his brother Aaron has already died, and Aaron's son father is the high priest. You might remember that we're told in the Bible that Aaron had 4 sons, Nadav, Avihu, Eleazar, and Itamar. And Nadav and Avihu died in some tragedy on the day that the tabernacle was consecrated, which is narrated in the book of Leviticus. So the 3rd son, Eleazar, succeeds him upon his death. So in the film, near the very, very end, Moses says to Eleazar, I think I know why Aaron died and wasn't permitted to see the promised land. I think he loved the people too much. Isn't that an interesting line? He loved them so much that he couldn't say no to them when they demanded the golden calf. And then Burt Lancaster's character, Moses, says, I so much wanted to see the promised land, but I think that maybe my sin isn't that I love the people too little. Isn't that intriguing? You don't have that in the Bible. Not only do you not have that in the 10 Commandments, but you don't have that in the Bible either, that Moses loved the people too little. So it seems to me that the movie maker is going out of his way to show us a great man, but a man with flaws, because to be human is to be finite. Even to be, as the Bible says of Moses, the greatest of all prophets, who understood God's speech more clearly than any other prophet did, even so, he's not more than a man. Now, this movie dates from the mid-1970s, as opposed to the mid-1950s. What has happened between the 1950s and the 1970s that might have taken the varnish off of our hero worship? Well, first of all, there was the revelation that we were spying on the Ruskies, Gary Power and the U2. Remember how shocked we were as Americans to learn that we were doing the same dirty tricks to them that they were doing to us? There was the Bay of Pigs. More so, there was Vietnam. And then there was Watergate, government scandals, right? So a filmmaker in the early 1970s might well have had reason to say, even the great people have some clay feet. I think that that's going on as well. Now, the next point I want to make is that there is a focus on women in this film, which is very different than the focus in the 1956 film. 1956 film is a classic golden age of Hollywood love triangle. Nefertari loves Moses. He doesn't love her. Ramesses wants to possess Nefertari. She'd rather have Moses. And so on and so forth, right? If that sounds familiar, remember 1949, Samson and Delilah. The Philistine captain loves Delilah. She doesn't love him. She loves Samson, etc., etc. You know, love triangles is the way in which DeMille tells Bible stories. And it's not the way the Bible tells Bible stories. You don't have a lot of love triangles in the Bible. Right? When you have a story of adultery, David and Bathsheba, that's not a love triangle. Although we're going to see that our 1951 movie tries to somehow make it into one a little bit, right? But that's not the Bible's point. So we have a particular image of the woman in the 1956 film, which is within the confines of golden age of Hollywood storytelling. Very different is the depiction of Miriam in this film. And Miriam has an important role from almost start to finish. So let's remember that in this film, unlike the biblical original, it's Miriam who takes the ark containing baby Moses to the water. Remember that? In the Bible, it's the mother. And in that beautiful animated picture, The Prince of Egypt, which is just a lovely, lovely film. Have you ever seen it? It's an animated film. The voice of Val Kilmer is the voice of Moses, and Moses' mother sings this lovely, lovely lullaby to Moses. It's sung by the Israeli popular singer Ofra Haza, who was the greatest Israeli singer of her generation. So it's the mother who takes the ark to the Nile and assigns the sister to just watch and see what happens. Here, Miriam herself takes it to the Nile, and that establishes a theme in this film: Miriam's involvement with water. So when you cut to the scene of the slaves toiling, Miriam is the water bearer who brings water to the slaves, including water to her brother Aaron. Now, this movie didn't make that up. That movie was found, that theme is found in DeMille's films as well. You have the lovely Lilia, Joshua's love interest in the Ten Commandments. There's another love triangle. She loves Joshua, but the evil Dathan, Edward G. Robinson, lusts after her, etc., etc. But in the 1923 silent film, which I think is DeMille's stronger telling of the Ten Commandments story. For one thing, it's only 45 minutes instead of 3.5 hours, so already it's got to be better. In the 1923 silent version of it, Miriam is the water carrier, and the Hebrew slave whom she loves is actually killed by the rolling wheel of Pharaoh's machines. And she lifts up her hands to heaven with a cry of protest, and that's what triggers the God sending Moses. So this notion of Miriam as the water carrier does have its pedigree in the movies, but notice how in this film, Miriam and water are connected, and it's not only there. At the sea, at the shores of the sea, when the hosts of Pharaoh and his chariots have all been drowned, this film has the women singing a song of praise to the Lord, led by Miriam. And that's exactly in the Bible. Exodus chapter 15, verse 22. Miriam led the women out, and they took their timbrels in hand, and they danced, and she sang with them, "Sing ye unto the Lord, for the Lord has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver has the Lord cast into the sea." So this film gets that, quote unquote, gets it right. It's very faithful to that. And then Miriam is connected with water one more time. Do you remember that after the Song at the Sea, they trudge through the wilderness for 3 days. They don't have any water. They're very angry at Moses. They're almost ready to stone him. The water they find is too bitter to drink. And then they keep going until they get to an oasis. The oasis of Elim with 12 wells and 70 palms. And she and her brother Moses are talking, oh, look how happy they are. They're just happy like children. And Moses says to his sister, there's really a very fine relationship between Moses and his sister in this film. He says to his sister, but they're going to have to keep moving. And she has the last word in the scene. She says, yes, the most important thing is to continue moving forward. Which is actually the truest thing that can be said about that generation, right? Because they had to move forward until they could end up in the promised land. It wasn't accomplished by that generation. They died in the wilderness. But she recognizes more than any of the people themselves recognize. So Miriam is a very important person in this movie. And ultimately, she dies. She's stampeded. Remember that? In the mayhem surrounding the golden calf. So in a sense, she dies a martyr's death, which is not in the Bible, but it's part of the character arc of Miriam in this story. So again, let me ask you, why would a film in the early to mid-1970s have such a departure from the 1950s model, and even a departure from the biblical original in its portrayal of Miriam? What do you think? 1970s.
Women becoming more important.
Much more in society, right? Anyone remember who the first female news anchor was in America? Barbara Walters, at just about this time, right? The first female astronaut, Sally Ride. And then there was Judith Resnick, who was killed in the accident, right? Remember that? So, how about, here's a name that some of you will remember, Geraldine Ferraro. Who remembers that name? Geraldine Ferraro. Yes, please.
First woman to run for
Vice presidential candidate. See that? So this is the era where women are coming into their own in American society. And in the retelling of the Bible story for this generation's audience, keeping women confined in the role of the Egyptian princess who's mooning after handsome Moses just is not. It's not going to make it for that audience. Then I'm going to give you a third major difference between this film and the 1956 film. The slaves in the 1956 film are only incidentally Hebrews. It's only incidental that they are Israelites. It's scarcely mentioned what their nationality is. They're anyone who is enslaved by a tyrant who thinks he's above God's law. And that's the essence of Pharaoh in DeMille's retelling. Pharaoh doesn't recognize God. It's not that he recognizes his gods, but he doesn't recognize the gods of the Israelites. He doesn't recognize God. He's above everyone. His word is law. If I can, it would take a long time to make this case, but I'll just say it and I think you'll understand it. 1956, Pharaoh is Joseph Stalin, the man who has no God and therefore no moral restraint. He will do anything that he wants, and he'll get away with it too, including mass murder. Nothing will stop him. So in the Ten Commandments, anyone who is not on the side of Pharaoh is going to be on the side of the slaves. It's not the story of the enslavement of the people of Israel. It could just as easily be the crushing of the Hungarian rebellion in 1956, the crushing of the rebellion in East Germany in 1953, any of the other times that the Soviet atheism crushed the freedom desires of the people behind the Iron Curtain. That's the story of the Ten Commandments movie of 1956. It's not the story of one particular people. This film, from opening sequence to closing sequence, lets you know that it's the story of the Israelites. Let's remember the first shot. you see there's a narration going on. Richard Johnson is the narrator. And we see a small tribe making its way with their camels and going on foot down to Egypt. Where are they coming from? They're coming from the land of Canaan. Why are they going to Egypt? Because there's famine in Canaan and there's food in Egypt. And that's what the narrative makes clear. And the numbers of people there, I didn't count them, but it seems very close to what the biblical book of Exodus tells us. 70 people. This band of 70 people came down to Egypt. So it's the story of Jacob and his wives and their children. And then, following the Bible, they are exceedingly fertile and multiply and grow quickly. And then the scene cuts and you see Pharaoh. I tell you, what he spent on mascara alone. I'd like to be his Helena Rubinstein. Although, do you know why the pharaohs had so much mascara? It kept the flies out of their eyes. You know, in Egypt, all these sand flies. So Pharaoh says, they multiply. Remember, for some reason the bad guys have these British accents. They multiply. And what he essentially orders is infanticide. Well, no, he doesn't do that first. First he orders to enslave them, thinking that the hard work will crush their spirit and they'll stop multiplying. And very close to the biblical original in chapter 1 of Exodus, it says, it didn't stop their multiplying. Quite the contrary. They multiplied more than ever. So then he orders the infanticide. Now, the movie departs from the Bible a little bit here, because the Bible depicts Pharaoh as ordering the infanticide of newborns, newborn males. But if you remember the scene of the Egyptian soldiers kidnapping children and throwing them into covered carts and then throwing them into the Nile, it's boy children of various ages. You see that? Newborns, toddlers, older than toddlers. So there's a vivid sense of genocide that this movie is emphasizing, and it's genocide against the Jewish people. So 1970s, Hollywood is beginning to deal with the Holocaust. Not surprising that we have this. In the 1950s, there was as yet almost no Hollywood dealing with the Holocaust. Almost none. There were one or two very oblique references. Movie from 1946, very fine movie, starring Robert Mitchum and Robert Ryan and Robert Young, the three Roberts, called Crossfire. Anyone remember Crossfire? There's this hate crime, a murder in Washington, D.C., and the detective, who happens to be Roman Catholic, solves it because he realizes that it's a hate crime. And he realizes it because he remembers the hatred that his ancestors as Roman Catholics in the United States were exposed to. And that's what allows him to think his way into the mind of the murderer who found a Jewish victim and just killed him. And there's a scene there where Robert Mitchum, who portrays the sergeant of a private soldier who's not guilty, but he's the red herring, people think he's guilty, who start talking about funny names that these people have. And what do they mean by funny names? I mean funny names like Goldberg, Jewish names. And Robert Mitchum says, where I was fighting, a lot of the dead bodies on our side had those exact funny names. So it's defending the honor of American minorities, although white minorities, who were fighting in World War II on the American side. But it's not yet dealing with the Holocaust per se. For that, it's a little bit late. Of course, you have the Diary of Anne Frank. That shows up very early. But the films that really opened it up about the Holocaust were films like Sophie's Choice. Right? So that's a little bit later. And of course, probably the most powerful film about the Holocaust was, I would say, Schindler's List. And that's already the 1990s. So in the 1970s, this film depiction of the slaughter of the male children going beyond the newborns, to me it feels like a way of acknowledging there's been a Holocaust that happened, and Pharaoh's genocide was the precursor to that. There was also the loathing that the Egyptian characters express for the slaves. They dehumanize them. They treat them as subhuman. And this too is I think, an echo of the Holocaust, because what the Nazis called Jews was Untermenschen, subhuman. And then there's also the music. The music is by the Italian movie composer Enrico Morricone, great film scorer, but there were supplemental songs by Dov Seltzer, or as his nickname was Doobie. Doobie Seltzer was one of the most successful Israeli songwriters of the 1960s and 1970s. And I get the sense that there was a conscious effort to give a more Middle Eastern sound, a more Jewish sound to the soundtrack. Not what you have in the Ten Commandments, which is it's a very good score, of course, but it's a typical Hollywood 1950s movie score. Whereas the score here is training your ear to think Jewish music. And if that's not enough, there's the repeated Israel, Israel, Israel. And it's the last thing you hear also. So it's really laying it on pretty thick. You cannot not know that this is the story of the enslavement of the Jewish people. Again, I see this as a direct response to the subordination of the thought that it's Israelites, it's Hebrews, it's Jews who are enslaved in the earlier film. Why did DeMille push that down? The same reason why he never says Jew or Israelite in Samson and Delilah. 1949, remember Victor Mature and Hedy Lamarr? By the way, she was as brilliant as she was beautiful. Do you know that? She was brilliant. So they never call the Israelites in Samson and Delilah. They come from the tribe of Dan. So what do the Philistines call them? You Danite dog. They never call them Israelites. Why is that? Well, let's think about it. 1949. It's already getting into the McCarthy years. The years of great worry that there are communists infiltrating the State Department. Who lost China was the big question of those years, because there'd been a civil war in China, and the communists under Mao Zedong won that fight, and the Chinese nationalists, who were the pro-Western ones, under Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan. We still have the after echoes of that in our foreign policy today. So, who lost China? And you might remember that in the war years, America was allied with Stalin. And it wasn't anti-American to have been a communist then. But boy, that changed pretty quickly. So there were Jewish communists because the communists were the strongest anti-fascists when Americans like Charles Lindbergh were still playing with isolationism. It's not our problem. Right? It was the communists, including Jewish communists, who said, you have to stop Hitler. And since we're all adults, I can tell you an ever so slightly risque story. Ever so slightly. Who remembers the name Bella Abzug? Remember Bella Abzug, great congresswoman from New York City with her signature hats? Well, she and my mom went to college together. Hunter College in the city of New York. Class of 1942. By the way, there were some really fine people in that class. Remember the Metropolitan Opera soprano Regina Resnick? Anyone know that name? She was a classmate of theirs as well. So anyway, what was the great cry that Stalin wanted America to do in 1942, 1943? Open up a second front. In other words, invade. We're taking the brunt of all the fight against the Wehrmacht. We're fighting them in Stalingrad, we're fighting them in Kharkov, we're fighting them in the Donetsk and all those places. You should be fighting them in France. Now, the truth is, we did have a second front. We had an air front. We were bombing them by day and by night. Okay, the Americans bombed them by day with its B-17 bombers, and the British with their Avro Lancasters bombed at night. And we were fighting them in North Africa, and we were fighting them in Sicily, and we were fighting them in Italy. There was a second front, but it wasn't good enough for Stalin. So the American communists used to say, open up a second front. So Bella Savitsky, apparently unaware of the risque way that this looked, would wear a sandwich board. You know how people on a picket line wear a sandwich board? And what her sandwich board said was, open up a second front. She never realized that that was a little bit gauche. So I thought I could tell you, I think we're old enough to be able to hear something over just a little bit tad risque. So there were Jewish communists, but by 1949, that was a very risky thing to do. So the Jewish executives in Hollywood wanted to underplay the Jewishness, and they tended to be very quiet about it. You don't see much in the way of Jewish identity coming out of Hollywood until later in the 1950s. You might remember the novels, the novel by Herman Wouk, Marjorie Morningstar. Remember Marjorie Morningstar? Starring the big dancer, Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly is the one who dances Singing in the Rain, right?
Yes.
Gene Kelly and Natalie Wood, right? They're the star and starlet of. And so there you have a bar mitzvah shown for the first time. Right? Well, not the very first time. I mean, you had it in the 1920s, but then it just stopped completely. So I believe that the DeMille film of 1956 underplays the Jewishness of the enslavement and the Exodus because of fear, because America at that time was a pretty scary place. By the way, if you want to see a recent film about how this anti-communism would destroy even the most brilliant career, I recommend you see the film Oppenheimer, about the great American physicist,
Yes.
and how he lost his security clearance over exactly that.
Yes. Great movie.
So the next point I want to have a little bit more time. The one more major point I want to make about this film is about the growing sense of identity of Moses. Moses as a Hebrew. Think about it. How would Moses know he was a Hebrew? All of the different movie makers have to dance around that. In the DeMille film, the elderly handmaiden of Pharaoh's daughter takes Moses' swaddling cloth. Remember that? Which apparently has the distinctive stripe of the tribe of Levi. Now, why Pharaoh's daughter wouldn't instantly know that he's Jewish because he's circumcised? Maybe you didn't talk about that in 1956. Maybe that was, they didn't even talk about underwear, they said unmentionables. So maybe that was unmentionable. So his swaddling cloth And at the end, Nefertari kills the woman instead of let that secret come out. Remember that in the 1956? Now, in 1974, how does Moses come to know that he's an Israelite? Well, let's remember, he's the charming older cousin of young Merneptah, who's going to be the next pharaoh. Remember that? And the young kid who's such a brat. By the way, there's a long tradition in movies of the pharaoh's firstborn son being a brat. It goes all the way back to the 1923 silent film. Because if God's going to kill the firstborn, we got to make this kid worthy of being killed. So the kid says, "You said you were going to take me crocodile hunting." Remember that? And Moses says, yes, cousin, your majesty, but that might be too dangerous for you. "Well, I'm cross with you, Moses. I'm going to order you to go visit the work site as a punishment." Remember that scene? So this little bully of a kid is the one who orders Moses to visit the slaves. And there he sees a taskmaster trying to rape the wife of Dathan. And in his zeal for justice, because that's who Moses is, he's zealous for justice, he kills the would-be rapist. It doesn't look like he wants to kill him. He seems to not know his own strength, and he beats him, and then he throws him off a platform, and the fall, and he dies in the fall. And then Dathan, instead of being grateful, says, now they're going to blame me, and I'm going to die because of what you did. And then in the next scene, you don't see who Dathan is talking to, but he's on his knees talking to some Egyptian in authority and saying that this Prince Moses is not an Egyptian. So that's how it comes out. And then Moses has to flee Egypt before he really even understands what it is to be a Hebrew. Remember that? And there too, he has a very important talk with his sister Miriam. I've mentioned Miriam before. The last person he talks to is Miriam as he's leaving Egypt. And he gets to Jethro. Again, the passion for justice. He saves Jethro's daughters from the malicious shepherds, just because it's the right thing to do. He's not looking to court any of them, but Jethro has the daughters bring him back. Think about this. It's so unromantic. He saves Tzipporah from being violated, and he doesn't even get her cell phone number. He's not interested in that. He just wants justice. Jethro says, "Bring him back." And Moses says to Jethro about the Hebrews, "I must learn to think of them as my people." So he's still not identifying fully as an Israelite, even after he's been exiled, because he is an Israelite. So notice that in this film, they are really trying to understand what would it feel like to have been educated as a prince of Egypt and then discover. It's like going to Henry Louis Gates. You know that Ancestry show? You go to Henry Louis Gates with your buccal swab of your DNA, and you discover that although my last name is D'Agostino, I'm really Hungarian. Something like that, right? That's a bit of a disorienting epiphany, right? So Moses has this disorienting epiphany, and it takes God at the burning bush to really bring him around. But even then, in a telling moment, I think it's Joshua he speaks to, back in Egypt, he says, "But the Lord did make one mistake. He chose me." So from start to finish, we have a Moses who can rise to the challenge, and he does, but he never stops being human. So I think that to pull it all together, that's what makes this film, flawed though it may be in some ways. If you want spectacle, you're not getting spectacle. right? The crossing of the Red Sea is, okay, you could also cross the Lafayette River. You know, you don't have walls of water, you know, you don't have a canyon of polymerized water. Right? You've got, you know, they get away. You know, imagine people trying to get away from a plantation in Carolina and picking their way through the dismal swamp.
Oh, boy.
Okay, that way the dogs can't find them, right? The dogs will lose the scent, right? That's more or less what you see in this film. It's not heroic, but it's very touching in its own way. I have to tell you, this is, despite the fact that it's not grandiose, this is one of my favorite Moses films. The same way that you sometimes might enjoy a string quartet even more than you enjoy a symphony. You know, it's told on a different canvas. It's told without the same pretentiousness, but it tells a very, very powerful story. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you want to watch it again, of course we can arrange for that as well. But for next month, you better start practicing your slingshot, because we're turning to the story of David and Bathsheba, which Hollywood turns into a passionate love story. Enjoy.
Okay, question time. I have a microphone. I'll run up to you if I figure out what to do with it. Tom? Oh, I got it. I got it. Who has a question? Come on.
And would you say your name before you ask your question, please?
Yes. Rabbi Panitz is great about talking to people directly.
Thank you very much. I'm Roger Furman. The movie to me was a little hard to watch in parts.
Well, I'm sorry, was what?
The movie was hard to watch in parts because the events that were in the movie, there are miracles, were not explained and portrayed. For example, the blood over the doors, and the Bible says it's hyssop. When they crossed the Red Sea, it was dry ground. These guys are wading in water. So how can they drown an army in 4 inches of water? I couldn't understand how that was going to happen, you know. And the water out of the rock, that wasn't explained. Or it wasn't there. I mean, there was water. And also the waters of Meribah was explained how that was solved. So there's a lot of events, like they did not have an advisor who knew the real thing on this movie set to make it right.
Well, I think the most honest answer I can give to that involves 2 words. Low budget. I think that they were dealing with the constraints of that. I'll give you one example. How did they show the miracle of the quail? Remember that? You've got these birds that supposedly enough birds to darken the sky. And they show you a little flock of birds, then they show you some people running with their nets and so on and so forth. And or they show you the miracle of the manna. So to me, it looks like the cotton candy machine at the circus broke. And you've got one person going, oh, wow. And that's how they do it. So it's, I believe that while I could be really fancy, the real answer is low budget. Thank you, Roger.
Next question.
Ma'am.
I do want to speak.
Would you wait for the microphone, please, and also say your name?
I do want to speak to being the youngest in the family who lived next door to a Jewish family. And
where did you grow up?
in Pittsburgh,
Pittsburgh.
yeah. Mhm. Every year, I got my Christmas gift.
Mhm.
Every year I got my birthday gift. And it was just a routine. It was not because I was any different than anybody or they were. It was just the routine that they did and that I benefited from. So I would sit on my porch and I'd start doing my homework. And the next thing I know, the man next door would come over and he'd put down the $5 right there next to what I was doing. And it happened through I was the youngest in the family, so that happened routinely. When I hear things that we talk about today, I still want us to not just talk about the negative, pull out of the garbage or pull out what we have in our head, pull it out and talk about it. They were great neighbors.
Mhm.
The woman next door to him was also Jewish neighbor, and every now and then she would send me a little card or something. But these are memories that obviously I still have, and they're still alive. Not the people anymore, but I just love the idea that I can still remember these, and I still can grow on the gift of the generosity and the relationship that other people will develop.
That's a beautiful thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let
Her
me
name is Carol.
Yes, Carol. Let me share with you words from a letter written by President George Washington to Moses Seixas, who was the warden, which is to say the lay leader, of the Newport, Rhode Island synagogue in 1790. President Washington received a letter of congratulations from Moses Seixas, and he writes back to him and he says, "For happily the government of these United States of America gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." That's the vision of America that I'd like to see more of today. And that you have just vividly portrayed that, and thank you for that.
Anyone else? Well,
Okay, get ready for David and Bathsheba.
it's been lovely.
Thank you
We
as
really-
always.
We really enjoyed you, and we look forward to 1 month from now.
Exactly 4 weeks.
Very good. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.